Ok, buenos días, comunidad del Duwamish Valley. Nos encontramos nuevamente en nuestro programa de radio y hoy día tenemos un importante tema que tratarlo con ustedes. Mi nombre es Edwin Hernandez, soy el Project Manager del proyecto a cargo de Just Health Action, donde hablamos, el objetivo principal es educar a la comunidad del Duwamish Valley en todo lo relacionado al source control del Lower Duwamish Waterway. Linn, could you say your background, please?
Sure. Hi, my name is Linn Gould, and I run a nonprofit called Just Health Action. And I have a grant with the Washington State Department of Ecology called a Public Participation Grant to increase public understanding and involvement in cleaning up contaminated waste sites around the state. As part of this grant, we are hosting this podcast series.
Mi nombre es Linn Gould y dirijo una organización sin fines de lucro llamada Just Health Action. Tengo una subvención del Departamento de Ecología del Estado de Washington llamado Subvención de Participación Pública para aumentar la comprensión y participación del público en la limpieza de sitios contaminados en el Estado de Washington. Como parte de esta subvención, estamos presentando esta serie de radio.
Okay, so this series is hosted by Duwamish River Community Coalition and co-sponsored by Just Health Action through the Ecology Public Participation Grant and the University of Washington Superfund Research Program.
Este programa es liderado por el Duwamish River Community Coalition, DRCC, con la co-participación de Just Health Action a través del fondo del Departamento de Ecología y PPG, y es un programa también subvencionado por el Superfund Research de la Universidad de Washington.
So last time we were here on June 8th with Deborah Williston from King County and Nate Hart from Seattle Public Utilities. We talked about source control, which is the process of finding sources of pollution, then stopping or reducing them before they reach the lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund site. Nate and Jessica answered questions that we had received from the community. Last week, we did a show on Duwamish Waterway Park and learned about what is happening there. And speaking of that, I have a quick correction I need to make. I said that SDOT was one of the prior owners of the DWP, and I called it the State Department of Transportation, and I really meant the Seattle Department of Transportation. But anyway, my guest here today is Priscilla Tomlinson from the Department of Ecology, who I've known for many years. She is here to talk about Ecology's cleanup process using Duwamish Waterway Park as an example. Welcome, Priscilla.
Hi.
En nuestro programa de radio del 8 de junio, contamos con la participación de Deborah Williston del condado King y Nate Hart de Seattle Public Utilities. Con ellos hablamos sobre source control y cómo específicamente sobre los procesos de encontrar fuentes de contaminación y cómo detenerlas o reducirlas antes de que lleguen al Lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund Site. Adicionalmente, Nate y Jessica respondieron preguntas que recibimos desde la comunidad. La semana pasada hicimos un programa donde hablamos sobre lo que está sucediendo en el Duwamish Waterway Park. Nuestra invitada del día de hoy es Priscilla. Priscilla Tomlinson, del Departamento de Ecología. Ella está aquí para hablar sobre el proceso de limpieza que el Departamento de Ecología utiliza para sitios contaminados y tomará como ejemplo de limpieza lo que se está realizando en el Duwamish Waterway Park. Bienvenida, Priscilla.
Okay, so Priscilla, first question is, what is your role at Ecology and what do you love most about your job?
I'm a biologist on the Lower Duwamish Waterway team, and I manage one of the sites near the river. It's precision engineering on the west side of the river. And I also support all of the other site managers that are managing sites along the river with technical and regulatory questions. And I manage a spreadsheet that everyone calls the pickles spreadsheet, which provides all of the raw materials that we need for determining cleanup levels for the sites along the lower Duwamish.
Ok, la pregunta fue, ¿cuál es el papel de ecología en todo lo relacionado al control? ¿Y qué es lo que más le gusta de su trabajo? La respuesta de Priscilla es, soy bióloga y soy parte del equipo de Lower Duwamish Waterway, del Departamento de Ecología. También administra su organización llamada Precision Engineering y da consultoría en temas normativos y técnicos a otros administradores que también realizan trabajos de limpieza en sitios contaminados. Limpiar la contaminación ambiental es como resolver un rompecabezas porque no podemos ver la contaminación. Y finalmente lo que nos comenta es que le gusta mucho ojear los datos para desarrollar una imagen de lo que está sucediendo en el sitio contaminado.
So what I like about my job is it's kind of like solving a puzzle, because if you go out and look at a site, you can't tell where the contamination is because the chemicals are invisible. And so we have to figure out what chemicals to look for and where to look for them just based on knowing environmental science. And then also when we get the results back, if you've looked at the tables in some of these reports that we produce, there's just these tables and tables of numbers, lots of numbers. And the numbers alone don't mean anything. So I like pawing through the data to develop a picture of what's happening at the site. And I feel very fortunate that I have a job that I enjoy. And in the process of doing my job, I get to help protect one part of our planet.
El trabajo que Priscilla le gusta es ver los números. Hay tablas y tablas y tablas con diferentes números. Ella procesa esos números en su cabeza y ve una figura de qué es lo que va, de dónde viene la contaminación, cómo va, para desarrollar una solución al problema. También se siente afortunada de tener un trabajo que disfruta y de ayudar y preservar una pequeña parte de nuestro hermoso planeta a través de controlar la contaminación.
Thanks, Priscilla. So what is MACA? What is it? I mean, a lot of people just call it MTCA, but maybe you could explain what it really is.
MTCA stands for the Model Toxics Control Act, and it's the regulation that the state of Washington uses for identifying, investigating, cleaning up contaminated sites, and then managing the sites after we've cleaned them up. And it's very similar to EPA's Superfund law.
La pregunta es, ¿qué significa MTCA? Algunos lo llaman MTCE, otros MACA. La respuesta de Priscilla es que MTCA o MTCA significa Model Toxics Control Act, y en español sería Ley de Modelos para el Control de Tóxicos. Esta es una ley que regula la manera como ecología identifica, investiga y desarrolla la limpieza de las propiedades contaminadas. Algo similar a lo que realiza la EPA.
Yeah, so how are Microsites different from EPA's cleanup sites? How do they compare, or how are they different?
Well, EPA and the Department of Ecology each maintain lists of contaminated sites, polluted sites. EPA's list contains the biggest, most complicated, most heavily polluted sites. The Department of Ecology does include EPA's sites on our list, but we have a notation that says that EPA is managing that site. And then we also include a whole bunch of sites that are not quite as complicated and not quite as heavily polluted. But having said that, I would also note that some of our sites are still pretty complicated. Examples would be the Packard site on the east side of the lower Duwamish, the Jorgensen Forge site. Specifically, we're dealing with the upland component of that site. We're not dealing with the sediment portion of that site. And also Gasworks Park. They're all pretty complicated sites. An important difference between EPA's sites and Ecology's sites is that Ecology includes sites that are contaminated by petroleum, but EPA, if the only contamination at the site is petroleum, EPA won't include that on their list. When it comes to the actual process of investigating and cleaning up, the two programs are very similar.
La pregunta es, ¿en qué se diferencian los sitios que se limpian bajo la norma de MTCA con los sitios de limpieza bajo las normas de EPA? ¿Cómo son iguales? La respuesta de Priscilla es, la lista de sitios contaminados indicados en la lista de la EPA suelen ser los más grandes, los más complicados y los más contaminados que hay. La lista de sitios contaminados en ecología incluyen sitios más pequeños y menos complicados que no están en la lista del EPA. Cuando se trata del proceso de limpieza de sitios contaminados, la EPA y ecología abordan el trabajo de una manera similar, ¿no? Ejemplos de limpieza, podemos hablar de la zona, el Forgerson, que está a cargo de la EPA, es un ejemplo de que está de la limpieza que está a cargo de la EPA, ¿no?
Thanks for explaining that. I think the community gets really confused between Jorgensen Forge, the upland site, and Jorgensen Forge, the sediment contaminated site. And the Jorgensen Forge sediment site is part of the lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund site. Thank you for explaining that. So my next question is, many people come to the Duwamish Waterway Park in South Park. And we understand that the park was originally being cleaned up under this program called a Voluntary Cleanup Program, but now it's moved to this formal legal cleanup process. Can you explain the difference between the two programs?
The Voluntary Cleanup Program typically involves simpler sites, and Ecology doesn't have a legal agreement with folks in that program, so it's voluntary. So they will ask us to review their documents, and if we think that their cleanup was adequate, we'll give them a letter called no further action. And that means we don't think any further action is needed to clean up the site. That's their goal. That's what they're trying to get when they enter that program. If we told them that they should do more work and they didn't do it, or they didn't do enough additional work, then we simply withhold that letter. And we don't really have any other legal recourse. And the VCP program doesn't have a lot of public participation requirements. So when we want to have a higher level of control over what happens at the property, then we enter into a legal agreement called an agreed order. And in this case, we can make requirements about what they do at the site. And if they refuse to do what we're requiring, then we get our lawyers involved. And there are a lot more public participation requirements for the formal program. So a lot more points in the process where we invite the public to comment on what we're doing. In the area of the lower Duwamish, we usually prefer to have sites managed on, oh, maybe I should stop and let Edwin, I'll pause for a moment.
Ok, gracias. La pregunta que se efectuó es, mucha gente viene al Duwamish Waterway Park de South Park. Entendemos que originalmente el parque estaba siendo limpiado bajo el programa de limpieza voluntaria, el VCP, y ahora esta limpieza se va a hacer bajo el proceso de limpieza formal. ¿Puede explicar la diferencia entre los dos programas? La respuesta de Priscilla, que nos ha comentado, es que el programa de limpieza voluntaria damos una opinión sobre si una limpieza fue adecuada o no, pero no podemos forzar a que suceda nada. Esto es con respecto a ecología, ¿no? Entonces, después, el programa de limpieza voluntaria no incluye mucha participación pública. Esto es un tema que no fortalece mucho a este proceso de limpieza en sitios contaminados. En sitios contaminados que se limpian de manera formal, ecología entra en un acuerdo legal llamado orden acordada. Y si el dueño de la propiedad no hace lo que ecología le pide, involucramos a nuestros abogados para solucionar estos problemas.
So for the Duwamish Waterway Park, the city of Seattle submitted reports to us and asked us to review those reports under the Voluntary Cleanup Program. And we started out with that approach, but we weren't getting everything that we felt like we needed. And it really isn't consistent with the way we're handling other sites along the lower Duwamish. And so eventually we just said, we need to give it the same amount of oversight that we do for all of the other sites on the lower Duwamish. So that's why we're moving over to an agreed order and we'll be in the formal program.
Ok. También se dice que en los sitios de limpieza bajo el programa formal hay más participación pública y esa es una ventaja de este programa. Mover la limpieza del Duwamish Waterway Park hacia el programa formal proporciona el nivel adecuado de supervisión consistente con otros sitios de contaminación de limpieza cerca al río. Entonces, lo que Ecología está manifestando es que el pasar la limpieza inicial bajo el programa de limpieza voluntaria al programa formal va a permitir una mejor supervisión y una mejor condición de la zona a limpiar.
So Priscilla, can you explain, this is also confusing, can you explain how the MOTCA process works? I think that Department of Ecology actually has a pretty cool diagram.
Oh, thank you for reminding me. I'll share my screen. Okay, so can you see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so this whole process it starts when we first find out about a property that might be contaminated. Somebody reports something, often they don't know whether it's contaminated. So we have to use our judgment to figure out whether we should include it on our list of polluted sites. And then we have a whole series of steps for assessing it, studying the contamination, looking at methods for cleaning up the contamination, documenting what we're going to do in a cleanup action plan, then going through the actual design of the cleanup, performing the cleanup, and then monitoring and managing the site afterwards. The meat and potatoes of what we do would be, I've shown the 3 steps in this diagram: the remedial investigation, the feasibility study, and the cleanup action plan. And and then there are these little comment boxes that indicate places where we are required to go out for public comment on what we're doing. So I think before I go into detail on those, I'll stop and let Edwin catch up with me.
Ok, la pregunta es, ¿cómo funciona el proceso de limpieza bajo la ley del modelo para el control de tóxicos? Priscilla nos está mostrando esta gráfica donde se indica todo el proceso que Ecología realiza para cuando encuentra cada sitio contaminado, desde la parte de la investigación inicial hasta la parte del monitoreo y control de los sitios contaminados. Ahí pueden ver cada etapa. Empieza con la investigación inicial, el análisis de las zonas contaminadas. Se empieza con la investigación preliminar, el estudio de factibilidad. Después se determina la acción del plan de limpieza. En estos 3 puntos, ellos le llaman meat and potato, que vendría a ser carne y papas para la limpieza del trabajo. En esta parte es donde se incluye la participación comunitaria a través de los comentarios públicos, para que luego pase a la etapa de la ingeniería, del diseño de la ingeniería, la limpieza del sitio y el monitoreo y control del área contaminada. Entonces, esa es la parte importante que recalca a Priscilla. En la participación comunitaria son estos 3 escalones que empieza desde el Remedial Investigation hasta el Clean Action Plan de esta gráfica.
Okay, in the remedial investigation, we are trying to understand the contamination picture at the site. Which chemicals are present? Where are they? Are they in soil, groundwater, sediment, surface water, air? And are they moving? And an example of a chemical moving would be if you have a chemical in soil, it could dissolve in rainwater and move with the rainwater down through the soil until it gets to the groundwater. And then once it's in the groundwater, it can move with the groundwater until it gets to the lower Duwamish River. You might not have thought about groundwater moving, but it does. And typically when groundwater is moving, it wants to move to the nearest surface water body, a river, a lake, or the ocean.
Ok. Vamos a hablar sobre la remediación de investigación remediadora. En esta fase tratamos de comprender el cuadro de la contaminación. Nos preguntamos qué productos químicos están presentes, dónde están, pueden estar en el agua, en el suelo, en el subsuelo, en el agua subterránea. También se preguntan cómo se están moviendo los productos químicos de un lugar a otro. Por ejemplo, ¿no? Los químicos se filtran por la tierra, por el suelo, pueden viajar hacia el agua subterránea para luego ser depositados o depositarse en el río, en el lago o en el océano.
And the reason it's important for us to know how the chemicals are moving is so that we can protect the lower Duwamish River. And I'm going to remind you of an analogy that you might have heard on one of the previous podcasts. If you were to spill some milk on your kitchen counter and it's dripping off the counter onto the kitchen floor, you're not going to start by cleaning up the kitchen floor because the milk from the counter is going to keep dripping and it's just going to be very frustrating. Well, so the same thing with the river. EPA is getting ready to clean up the sediment in the river. But if we don't clean up the sites, the upland sites along the river, then after EPA has the sediment cleaned up, there'll just be fresh pollution moving into the river to recontaminate the sediments. And obviously we don't want that to happen.
Entonces, la función que tiene ecología es justamente proteger nuestro Lower Duwamish Waterway. Entonces, si el agua, ellos ven que el agua puede filtrarse y terminar en el río, ella le gusta la analogía que usamos en nuestro anterior programa. ¿Qué pasa si la leche se derrama en el piso de la cocina? Primero, para evitar que se vuelva a ensuciar, primero limpiamos la leche que está en el repostero y una vez que controlamos la leche que está ahí, recién después limpiamos el piso. Y con eso garantizamos que ya el piso no se vuelve a ensuciar. Lo mismo hace EPA. Primero va a limpiar los sedimentos, pero para asegurarse de que no se vuelva a contaminar el río, lo que le ha pedido Ecología es que primero limpie todas las zonas contaminadas que están cerca al Lower Duwamish Waterway Park. Entonces, esa analogía es similar.
In the feasibility study, at this point, we know the contamination picture, and now we look at the different technologies we could use to remove or control the chemicals. And we do a cost-benefit comparison of the different technologies, but we don't necessarily pick the approach that would give us the most cleanup for the least cost. We might pick a cleanup that's a little bit more expensive if it will remove a lot more contamination.
En la parte de estudio de factibilidad, lo que se usa es uso de tecnología para determinar cuál es la mejor manera de hacer la limpieza bajo un enfoque de costo-beneficio. Toda esta información queda documentada para luego seleccionar la alternativa en un plan de acción de limpieza. Ahora, no necesariamente todo lo que se limpia se selecciona lo más caro o lo más barato. Se busca el mejor impacto. Hay veces que sale más barato dejar la contaminación como está, pero sin alterar la parte ambiental.
Wow, thanks, Priscilla. It's a complicated, long cleanup process. But I love the public participation part. That's great. We're going to take a pause for a second, and we'll be right back.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, Priscilla, how many cleanup sites are there on the Duwamish? And can you talk about the connection between MOTCA cleanup sites and all the other shows that we've been doing on source control?
Well, the exact number changes from day to day because we're constantly finding new contaminated properties and finishing cleanup on some properties. To give you a sense of perspective, we've got over 13,000 contaminated sites listed across the state on our list of contaminated properties. About 180 sites have stormwater outfalls that dump into the river. And so the source control that we do on those properties involves some of the things that you've talked about in the previous podcasts, business inspections and discharge permits and that sort of thing. And then 65 sites are close to the river where we think that the chemicals in the soil and the groundwater could actually travel to the river. And so the source control that we do with those properties is the kind of MOTCA cleanup work that I've been talking about. Cal.
Ok, la pregunta es, ¿cuántos sitios de limpieza hay en el Duwamish? Y puede hablarnos sobre la conexión entre los sitios de limpieza bajo el modelo, la ley de modelo para el control de tóxicos y el source control. La respuesta de Priscilla es que actualmente en todo el estado de Washington tenemos una lista de sitios contaminados y que son alrededor de 13,000 sitios. Y continuamente se están buscando más propiedades contaminadas. Esto no para. Alrededor de 180 sitios contaminados tienen desagües pluviales, o sea, los desagües que contraen agua de lluvia, que desembocan en el Lower Duwamish Waterway Park, en el Lower Duwamish Waterway. En estos sitios realizamos source control mediante la inspección de los negocios y el uso de permisos de descarga, tal cual lo comentamos en nuestros programas anteriores, nuestros invitados de Seattle Public Utilities y King County. Y alrededor de 65 sitios contaminados cerca del río Duwamish, donde los productos químicos del suelo o del agua subterránea podrían llegar al río, es donde hacemos el source control. En estos sitios se están haciendo la limpieza bajo la ley del control de tóxicos o MTCA.
Right now, we've got 28 sites along the river that are being managed either by the Department of Ecology using our formal program that I talked about just a little while ago, or by EPA. We'd like to do more, but we're limited by staffing. I'd like to point out that the chemicals that we're cleaning up under MATCA are historical contamination that occurred back years ago before we had environmental regulations. And we thought it was okay to just dump or bury, our waste. And if it was out of sight, it was out of mind. But nowadays we have regulations in place to prevent people from doing that. So in theory, we're not creating any new MATCA sites. The new sites that we're finding are historical contamination, and we just didn't know about it before.
Ok, actualmente la Ecología y la EPA están administrando limpieza en 28 sitios. O sea, se dan cuenta, al comienzo hablábamos de 1.300 sitios contaminados en todo el estado de Washington, 180 desembocan en el Lower Duwamish, pero los sitios donde se está concentrando EPA y Ecología son 28 actualmente. Ellos quisieran seguir limpiando más, pero tienen la restricción de limitaciones por el personal. Lo que Priscilla nos comenta es que actualmente la contaminación que existe en las zonas que están limpiando es una contaminación histórica, no es una contaminación que se está dando ahora. Esto se da como motivo que en la antigüedad las industrias descargaban directamente ya sea en el río o en el suelo. Pero esto ya está controlado actualmente. Esta práctica ya no se hace. Lo que se está haciendo es justamente limpiar estas zonas que antiguamente se contaminaron para proteger a nuestro Lower Duwamish Waterway.
Wow. I didn't realize there was so much historical pollution. Okay, so people keep on hearing about cleanup numbers for different chemicals, but I don't think they really understand like how you go about developing a cleanup number for each chemical. And I'm just going to do an example. Everyone hears about PCBs for the Lower Duwamish Waterway Superfund site, but they don't really kind of understand how that works. So could you, I think you might also have a graphic for that too that you were going to show, or is that some other later? And you're on mute.
Okay. So I will share my screen. Can you see the new graphic?